Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dignities and Disasters, presented by Integral Centered Leadership and me, Robert MacNaughton. This is a podcast series that attempts to skillfully tease out both sides of divisive topics. So instead of falling prey typically to our natural human biases and what we call an either or mindset, I'm encouraging us to get more informed and develop a more sophisticated or both and understanding of the important subjects that we talk about here so that we can be more effective leaders, that we can be more successful with our endeavors in our personal and professional relationships, conversations anywhere that we're having. And I'm excited today about the topic and my guest. I've been wanting you, Dr. Keith Witt, to join me for anything, just to further introduce you to as many people as possible. If you're already in the Integral audience, I'm sure they know you, but happy to have you with us, and particularly helping us unpack this pretty nasty topic from my perspective of narcissism. So welcome, Keith. How do you feel about working on this one today?
I'm stoked about it. I'm happy. I told the woman who was cleaning my teeth, I was saying, she said, well, I hope your talk goes well. I said, look, I could wake up at 2:00 in the morning and give a talk on narcissism for like 4 hours. I mean, come on, you've done as much therapy as I have. You really have learned narcissism in all its forms, both positive and negative.
Perfect. Yeah. So we've already been talking about some things, and so I'm really excited to have you here. So let me give the audience just a little more background on you if they don't already know you. So you're a licensed clinical psychologist, but you're also a lecturer. You're an author of over a half a dozen books, and you've been creating transformative healing systems. For over 40 years, you've been practicing psychotherapy in Santa Barbara. I think you've clocked it at something like over 55,000 therapy sessions with individuals, couples, groups. You're a major contributor to Integral Life, which is the formal community of the integral philosopher Ken Wilber. And so you're consistently providing content to that community. You're also regularly with Jeff Salzman on the Daily Evolver podcast, probably the most popular integrally oriented podcast if you're not associated with that. And, you've been in a rock band, you're a lifelong martial artist, karate practitioner, and so many other things. And so if you guys haven't come associated with Keith, go to his website, drkeithwitt.com, and I'll provide more. And I want to talk more about some of the books you've written, as we're wrapping up. So once again, just really honored to have one of my role models and teachers and people that I aspire to live like you more to have on this show.
It's very sweet. Thank you. It's great to see you, Robert.
Yeah. It's like my own narcissism. It's like this podcast it's just Robert's friends and opportunity to share Robert's friends with his friends. So.
Well, I'm pleased. I'm pleased to be shared.
Okay, so we're going to talk about narcissism. And the way I want to unpack this one, because there's so much, as you said, we could talk for hours about this. But in service of the Dignities and Disasters theme, I want to first kind of unpack, like, what are we talking about? What is the definition, the denotation of narcissism? And then, like, what are the cultural connotations? Like, what do people usually mean or think in our kind of modern culture when you have a term that, especially in personal development communities, every day I see a new article posted on Facebook of like how to tell if your spouse is a narcissist and what are the signs to look out for. I did some research. There's like over 65 million posts on the internet about narcissism, not as much as, depression and anxiety, but on the rise. And then, just you get into some of the nuances there and we might just be planting the seeds of like dignities and disasters of mental illness in general and how culture relates to that and pathologizing things. And then how does narcissism in its healthy forms live within all of us and go through that. Does that sound like a reasonable arc to you?
Sounds great.
Awesome. Well, I thought like a good place to start was history. And let's go all the way back to Ovid's Metamorphosis of the story of Narcissus. And those, you probably have some recollection of this, of the beautiful young boy who, after mything Echo, was punished by the gods by being led to this pond and falling in love with his reflection in the pond, being so enamored that he falls in and dies. And then the Narcissus flower and the lake turns to salt, depending on what translation you're going for here. But that's how I remember the story. Is that how it lines up for you?
That's how it lines up for me. And the flower of the narcissus is one of the sweetest smelling flowers for me
Ah,
in the world, and I have a lot of them around my house. So every they bloom in the late fall, early winter. There's a little field of narcissus.
so it's not just the flower that thinks it's great. It's actually others think
Yeah,
it's great as well. So
that's right. Others give that narcissistic flower that give the narcissus lots of narcissistic supply.
yeah. And then, just I'm a big Greek fan, but it's just like, take it further, like, and the hubris is often linked with narcissism. And my favorite thing about hubris is that it inevitably leads to nemesis. And so when we're so self-aggrandizing in our ego project of the world, it leads us to our nemesis, which is the healing and transmutation there. But I won't go too deep down to that. But take us further, Dr. Keith, into the history of narcissism, from the Greeks and how it lives in modern psychology today.
People understood interiors largely through myth and legend
Mm.
until the end of the 19th century when Freud started talking more about the unconscious. It had been discussed in intellectual circles. Fechner did, other people did for a long time. Partly, I think, in response to Eastern mythologies and Eastern practices coming across into Europe. Because Buddhism is a very interiorly oriented system. It's more technology of transformation and self-awareness, really, than a religion.
Mm-hmm.
And it was beginning in one way or another to influence everybody. But Freud recognized there is an unconscious and that the unconscious basically dominates how we move through the world. And then as he discovered that the people talking about stuff that they didn't usually talk about or they were ashamed of or they were frightened of, they began to feel better and have insights about themselves. He developed a psychoanalytic method. And out of that, he really wanted to make psychology a science. And so he started taking problems that people had emotionally and behaviorally and diagnosing them like doctors diagnose infections and stuff, which is a problem. That was kind of an original sin of psychotherapy.
Uh-huh.
Because basically all the psychopathologies are things that people have, we all have capacities for, but instead of fitting in with an ecosystem that's a functional ecosystem with ourselves and interpersonally with other people, one or more of them is acting in a way that's screwing that up. Okay.
So
and,
good.
and so there's some natural human capacity like grandiosity or depression or anxiety or paranoia or all these things. Projection, we project all the time. And it's not, somehow it's out of balance. And as it gets out of balance, it causes problems. And then in the DSM-5, the Book of Woe, there's a bazillion designations, and these are all the characterizations. And they're not like physical illness. I'm sorry. It's different. There are metaphors. I mean, physical illnesses are almost always caused by systemic problems, unless you get hit by a bus. But getting hit by a bus is a lot like getting raped. There are things that will happen to you physiologically if you get hit by a bus, and there's things that will happen to you psychologically if you get raped or if you get shot or something.
Yeah.
But a lot of the psychological stuff is, it's just arising out of whoever we are. And there's something that we can't regulate in some way, and it causes a problem.
Okay, let me make sure I'm following you so far. So it's like Freud really promoted a revolution with looking at our interiors and particularly our unconscious interiors and like talking about it, helps people feel better. And he wanted to make it a science. And so he started over correlating it with like physical illnesses. And
That's
so
right.
now to this day, we have the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, like you call the Book of Woe. It's the 1,000 reasons of how humans are messed up in the head that current psychologists and psychiatrists use as their diagnosis Bible.
That's right. When it first came out in 1951, it said on the front page, this is just to be used for research and it shouldn't be used clinically.
Oh,
all right.
God.
That was the first edition. And they did it so that the American Psychiatric Association could bill for their services. That's why they did it. Even though it said on the first page, you're not supposed to do that. And then by the time it got to the DSM-3, they took out that first page. So, there's that. So Freud saw these problems, and one of the problems he saw was narcissism. Narcissism was people had difficulty with their object relations. They couldn't really connect with other people, but they felt entitled and they felt like they were the greatest and they felt like people owed them an awful lot.
Mm-hmm.
And when people gave them any kind of feedback about some imperfection, they took profound offense.
Hmm.
And so Freud said that was pathological narcissism, which of course it is. And he put that together with an awful lot of stuff, and then he wove it together with his libidinal theory of development, and it became all that Freudian stuff.
So you said object relations, people that have problems with object relations. What does that mean? What does object relations mean?
A lot of people were excited by the idea of the unconscious and the reality of the fact that if I have emotional, spiritual, relational problems, I can go talk to somebody about them and get relief.
Yeah.
Okay, this just lit a lot of people on fire. And they started discovering things about it. Two of Freud's contemporaries, Alfred Adler and Carl Jung, went in directions that for them were more realistic and more representative of people. Carl Jung went the mythological route, the archetypal route, the interior figure integration route. And Alfred Adler went the relational route. He went, look, obviously, if we feel like we can get things done and we see everybody else as our friend rather than our enemy, we do pretty well. And those two people, and Freud was all pissed off at both of them because they wouldn't go with his theory, and then they stopped talking to each other, and all this early 20th century, egocentric male bullshit. And so, but people kept on learning stuff, and people kept on exploring stuff. And there was a group of people, Kernberg and Kohut, and a guy named James Masterson, who became what were called object relations people.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did is they looked at the developmental sequence and they recognized people are relational. All right. It's not individual development. It's always development in relationship with other people. When I give lectures for the last 20 years, the first thing I say is everything is relationships. Because everything is relationships. So these people saw that and they went, okay, so the infant relates to parents, but then eventually the infant relates to themselves. And there's an interplay between the inner figures of the infant and then the child and then the adolescent and the adult that are similar to not just the figures, but the relationships with the people in the cultures that the children were growing up in. And they called that object relations. And they all postulated that there was a healthy self, which is pretty good, and the ego, they call it the executive ego, that kind of has to manage all these other objects and has to manage doing relationships with other objects. They even went so far as to say that the infant really has a relationship with the breast. He doesn't have a relationship with the mother. Huh. Okay, now.
Okay. Object relations.
Yeah, these are the kind of theories that guys come up with if they don't talk to women about women and infants.
Sounds right.
The first part of the 20th century is full of stuff like this. Like you're not supposed to feed kids on demand. A bunch of guys came up with that idea. That screwed up a bunch of kids, me included,
Don't negotiate with terrorists. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, God. I don't know. I'm a pretty happy guy. Maybe I'd be a lot happier if I was breastfed. I don't know. We'll never find out. Anyway, so they were called object relations. And then when they were working with people, they would conceptualize these people in terms of how are they dealing with their own inner objects and how they're dealing with other people, their object relations with other people. Mm-hmm. And what they noticed is that there's some people that weren't very good connecting with other people. Their connections were shallow at best. And they were manipulative in the sense that they wanted other people to tell them they were great. They felt better than other people. They felt entitled. They felt grandiose. And if somebody else was distressing for them, they didn't want to have anything to do with them. Okay? So people kept discovering this, and they called it narcissism, and then narcissistic personality disorder. And they found out that to this day, weirdly, psychoanalysis is the treatment of choice for narcissistic personality disorder because why? Psychoanalysis is developing intense object relations between you and a therapist.
Yes.
And And so you want to deepen that, deepen that, deepen that, deepen that, have problems come up with that. Instead of the narcissist demeaning and withdrawing, the narcissist stays connected, works through it, and theoretically begins to resolve their narcissism and is able to have deeper relationships and is able to reflect on their own darkness that they've been avoiding all their life, and so on
Does
and
that
so
work?
on.
Does that happen?
Not in my practice. My practice, if I get somebody that is close to either has narcissistic personality disorder or has profound in that direction, I know that I have a limited number of sessions to help them improve their life before something happens where I'm not giving them the narcissistic supply that they need.
Right.
They will do what narcissists do, which is a signature characteristic of narcissism. They will demean and withdraw.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I have 10 sessions, sometimes I have 2 sessions, sometimes I'll have 20 or 30. Some people will make it all the way through into being able to have healthy relationships with other people. That's relatively rare. Freud and those guys had an advantage. They saw people a lot. I see people once a week. Now that I'm the more well-known I've been, the more people can afford me.
Sure.
And so I can see people more regularly. But that particular kind of treatment is difficult in today's world. It's very, very tricky working with a narcissist because on one, they really need to feel like you recognize their inherent human specialness and you see the beautiful parts of them. But on the other hand, they need to be confronted about their own destructive shadow.
Right.
And so it's a fine line. And so Kernberg and Kohut, two of the object relation people, they would get into arguments. Kohut would say, well, you got to give them a lot of narcissistic supply in the beginning. And Kernberg go, no, you got to confront them in the beginning. They would go back and forth. My favorite of those guys was a guy named James Masterson, who worked a lot with adolescence. Adolescence is a time when you're developing your sense of self. And so you're a little bit more fluid. And so he would find adolescents that had diagnosed with borderline traits. So at least up until recently, you weren't supposed to diagnose personality disorders with adolescents. That's been changing somewhat. And so he found that if he could establish certain kinds of relationships with these kids, and if he could help them make that transition into an adulthood that involved increasing levels of balanced self-awareness and relationships with other people, where he could say, as he said, they could be responsible, feel 100% responsible for everything they experienced and did, and see other people as psychological beings rather than objects, that the kids that were more entitled, narcissistic, grandiose, and so on, they could grow in that direction. And the borderline kids that would tend to do borderlines tend to have a diffuse sense of self. They tend to be very hostile. And when they're distressed, they don't demean and withdraw like narcissists. They want to cling and torture, punish people. And he found that he could help these kids if he had the right kind of therapeutic relationship for the right period of time. Since then, what we've discovered through research is that individual therapy really isn't enough for personality disorders. You really need to have some kind of cultural surround, at the very least groups. Dialectical behavior therapy is like that. Milieu therapy is like that.
So very, very difficult. So if we're talking about like proper personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, which is less common, like which is fairly rare, right?
Yeah, 1 to 3% of the population. People disagree.
Yeah. So maybe it's possible to like design a life where you can overcome those liabilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's not like overcoming typical depression or something like that.
Yeah. A personality disorder is characterized by, so here's the difference between narcissistic traits and narcissistic personality disorder.
Great.
Okay. We all have narcissistic traits.
Thank you.
That there are times when we feel like we're the greatest, or we feel entitled to something, or it's all about me, or something like that. Okay. Or you hear about something and you go, oh, what does that mean about me? Okay. It's that kind of profound self-absorbed stuff. Okay. Now, on a healthy level, because we're talking about dignities as well as disasters here.
Yes.
That's a 1-year-old. And
yes.
What Margaret Mahler called that was primary narcissism. A 1-year-old is just discovering that he's a separate self from mom. Okay, which is pretty cool. And this kid is, if he's had just good enough parenting, as Don Winnicott called it, He's been basically, everybody's just adored him his whole life, or her whole life. I am
Totally.
the greatest. And now I'm beginning to walk around, but I'm not walking around too fast because I'm not, so that's not. And so about 12 months old, wow, I'm the greatest. And I get almost constant approval. Primary narcissism, isn't it great to be me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so we want to nourish that. We want to nurture that. Now, part of the problem with being a 1-year-old is that around 10 months old, you start developing the capacity to feel a separate enough self that when someone disapproves of you, you can feel a shame emotion.
Oh.
Kids younger than 10 don't feel shame emotions. They don't blush if you disapprove of them.
Uh-huh.
10, 11, 12-month-old, they'll start to blush. Why? They have enough of a separate sense of self that if you disapprove of me, I feel a shame. Shame is a parasympathetic affect that's very uncomfortable.
Yes.
Now, it's necessary for development. Narcissists don't feel enough shame. Narcissistic personality disorder. And one of the
Okay.
reasons I wrote my book, The Gift of Shame, is that between 10 months and 17 months, the average kid hears the word no about every 8 minutes.
Right.
Because once a kid can start getting around, they can move. They're getting into stuff. It's no, don't do that. Take that out of your mouth, whatever. When that kid gets disapproved of, they'll feel a little bit of shame. They'll stop, they'll blush, their neck muscles and shoulder muscles get a little bit weak. And then the parent picks them up and says, just don't play with dog poop or whatever the hell it was.
Right.
And, you're still great. And the kid, a normal kid in about 10 or 15 seconds is back to happy sympathetic arousal.
They regulate.
Yeah, and regulated back until about 8 minutes. This is called the practicing period by Margaret Mahler. And if parents are good with this, they're attuned to their child and they go back and forth, the kid is being socialized. They're
Yes.
finding out you don't learn about empathy by people just empathizing with you. You learn about empathy by people saying, hey, wait a minute, stop hitting me. That hurts. Okay. Oh, it hurts you when I hit you. Okay. And this is true throughout all of development.
But you have to have a sense of other. And so it's like, just tracking back a little bit, right? So it's like around 10 months or so, the sense of self comes online where I'm actually a separate being, and that's healthy and natural. But that doesn't mean I'm so cognitively developed that I know that another person. And so it's like, John Piaget, the childhood developmental psychologist, right? So pre-operational cognition, right? I'm a separate self, I'm strutting my stuff. But there's that famous exercise that, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but he would like show, one side of a book and say, this is brown, this is black. And okay, which side are you looking at? Brown. Well, what's the color I'm looking at? Well, they say, well, brown, because they can't have a concept that another person is having another experience.
That's right. And which develops. Those are developmental milestones that you just described, and that Piaget was fascinated with, particularly cognitively, from a sensory standpoint and a cognitive standpoint. But you also have those every developmental line. You have it on the physical line, on the psychosexual line. You have it on the psychosocial line. You have it on the integration of defenses line. Now, if there's a certain combination of a lot of hostility and aggression, but sometimes other things, and a parent that's indulgent but not in tuned, an indulgent parent, the kid gets a lot of yeses, doesn't get appropriate or consistent no's. And also, if you have a permissive parent where a kid's not getting what they want and they start raising their level of emotional intensity, and the parent gives the kid what they want to shut them up, which parents do a fair amount.
Yep.
The kid starts feeling a sense of entitlement to get what they want, because you're basically negotiating with the nervous system. The nervous system says, okay, I get the rules. The rules is I get what I want, and if I don't get what I want, I start raising hell, and then I get what I want.
If I just get louder and louder, they get angrier, but eventually it works. So I just have to keep going until I get what I want.
Yeah, and so there's not a self deciding that. There's a nervous system being programmed for that.
Yes.
And this is why we need culture. Why? Well, we're all addicted to other people. We all grow up in cultures. And also, all cultures have hierarchies in them, authority hierarchies. Every single human culture does. So much so that when you walk into a room, there's a part of your brain that socially references everybody in terms of how they fit into personally relevant social hierarchies, which are, they can be growth, they can be dominance, but they're hierarchies. And it will disturb you if someone seems to be acting either above or below their place on that hierarchy, or where they're treating you like you're below your place.
Right.
You won't, though you're not going to mind it if they treat you above your place.
Yeah, right.
And
Yeah.
so someone with a narcissistic personality disorder feels like I always have to be at the top. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, we can see this from a developmental standpoint on red. Okay. What's a red power god? Red power god is I'm at the top, and that's it. You do what I say, and if you do, fine. And if you adore me, fine. And if you don't, then you're gone. Okay.
So this
That's
is
unhealthy.
read in developmental psychology, some of the shorthand we have for like this egocentric level of development that like, and it's kind of so is this like arrested development where I'm just kind of stuck at egocentrism, or is it like true? And like historically, it's like, that's as high as you could get, cognitively. And it's just, that's where we peak out.
My own belief about this, and most of the research I've seen supports this. When people developed self-aware consciousness, and then about 50,000 years ago, when the frontal lobes kind of finally made it down, the frontal lobe kept expanding till it finally made it down, so it was kind of touching the brainstem. People, there was a certain, but it probably started 200,000 years ago with a mutation on the FOXP2 gene. There were 2 mutations on, I think, 415 sites. They gave us the capacity for metaphor and for grammar, for I, you, me, we, in the past, present, and future. I think that probably was the birth of modern human consciousness. Evolution accelerated at that particular point, and then really accelerated 50,000 years ago. It was only 10 or 15,000 years after that where we begin to see evidences of civilizations, of ridiculously complex. To this, there's a city an ancient city called Baltic in the Mideast, where about 35,000 years ago, people moved 100-ton boulders 5 miles to build something. And to this day, we don't know how they did that.
No idea how that's possible.
The Sphinx wasn't developed by the Egyptians 2,000 or 3,000 years BC. It was discovered by them. Some previous civilization had done the Sphinx. The
ancient Greeks had ancient or more ancient.
There's always some more ancient. Anyway, I think in all of these civilizations, there are always people pretty much at the different levels. Yeah. But the percentages have changed until now. We have more people at formal and post-formal operational cognitive levels. We have more enlightened teachers now, not just by numerically, but percentage-wise.
Yes.
I suspect that we have more people at integral altitudes on a wide variety of developmental lines than ever before. And that's changing consciousness. That's changing civilization. And part of the way that it's changing is there's just a lot less poverty and violence and war and that kind of stuff than there used to be.
Yes.
Now, there's also a lot of horrible stuff happening. I'm not saying there's not, but there's always been individuals. Now, they were very lonely. St. Augustine, I think, was a pretty lonely person. Socrates was arrogant because he was the only guy that saw all that stuff. Okay. And, Plato felt really special because he was one of the guys, he was maybe the only guy that really got Socrates at a deep level.
He deserved that specialness, I think.
Right. And then Aristotle said, you guys are all a little bit too airy-fairy, and basically started modern science. I mean, it must have been a lot of fun to be an educated ancient Greek guy. You could just discover geometry, right? Hey, anyway, so there have always been these things, but we haven't been able to look at them. We haven't been able to access other wise people. We haven't been able to do the kind of research. The scientific method is an incredible engine of generating knowledge. So this is a long answer to your question. All these stages have always existed in my mind, but there were relatively few people at certain levels, and now we have more and more and more people at the more mature levels.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, and those y'all that are listening, it's like this is some real integral developmental geekery that, like, I can't get enough of, and I hope you're enjoying it as well. And I think is really necessary for like having a more nuanced understanding of when we're looking in this modern and postmodern culture that we're at and how we're relating to something. We've got this term narcissism, which gets thrown around a lot and thrown at myself. I mean, through this whole conversation, I'm like, as you're naming, the different, cluster B personality disorders, like, oh, maybe that's the one that's what's really wrong with me, I'm doing all this. And so there's epidemics of how we relate to mental illnesses, personality disorders, and this distinction between narcissistic traits versus the actual personality disorder, I think is the most important thing that I want people to be grokking from this.
And specifically, if you want to kind of simplify it for you, can you receive critical feedback, look for the validity of it, and then change in the result as a result of that? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm quite masochistic. I crave critical feedback, but once again, I'm being kind of caricaturing in that, like, it's really important to me, especially with my business as an executive coach. It's really important that I get feedback from my clients and from my partners so that I can level up.
Yeah, one thing that Carl Jung said once when he did therapy, he said, "What I do in therapy is I take on my client's wounds and I heal them in myself, and in the process, the client wounds become healed."
Yeah, how
Um,
shamanic.
he's a very shamanic guy. Uh, uh, and so, if you can receive influence, even if you feel like you're great and you're good at stuff, if you recognize you can always be better, and if you can receive influence and change, all right, you probably don't have narcissistic personality disorder. If you have relationships that matter to you, and if there's a problem, you don't just discard this person to move on to the next one. You go, well, let's see if we can solve the problem first. Now, that being said, most of us in the modern era have had many relationships and are not intimate with quite a number of people
Yeah.
that we knew when we were children and adolescents. Part of that is we have this ridiculously mobile society where, starting at the turn of the century, the 1900s, before that, people would often live in the same community for many years. That hardly ever happens anymore. Okay, so the nature of relationships has changed. Also, as we've become less conformist, well, I want to make a comment about this. Let's do it kind of an integral geek thing.
Do it.
Okay, so there's tribal. Okay, so that's purple and spiral dynamics, infrared, and okay. Now, tribal society, if someone feels entitled to screw things up,
Yep.
there's a tribal response.
Yeah.
Okay? Like there was a Bushman tribe where this guy killed 3 people. Something, who knows, brain damage, something. And so the tribe got together and said, we can't have this guy around. He's going to kill somebody else. So a bunch of the guys got together, and they killed him. And then everybody in the tribe had to come and stick him with something.
You mean they
Because
didn't have a restorative justice process?
no restorative justice for the guy who killed 3 people in the Bushman society. And the reason why everybody had to stab him is that this is a tribal response to this guy, and they didn't want any one person to bear the burden of having to kill another person.
Mm.
The tribe itself is a regulatory mechanism, which is quite beautiful, but it's also incredibly fragile.
Brutal. Democratized capital punishment.
Democratized capital punishment. When you go into the next level, red power gods, where somebody kicks ass and gets everybody to control everybody, clearly a narcissistic position. Narcissists tend to rise to the top in social groups. They tend to seek power. They tend to choose it disproportionately. They choose leadership roles. So once people were not governed by the tribe, once people said, oh, I'm going to get a bunch of people and put them together into a group. Some people think that this really happened in a big way when the volcano Thera exploded in 1655 BC, and a huge 300-foot tidal wave just wiped out all the relatively peaceful civilizations in the Mediterranean. And we see a lot of brutal regimes coming after that, where some guy got a bunch of people together and they got a bunch of bronze swords and they just went and massacred everybody until they said, okay, you're the greatest now. And so this is kind of narcissism, pathological narcissism, turning into red power gods. And what a lot of people don't realize is the guy at the top isn't the only narcissist in that system. Authoritarian systems have people that kiss ass to the person above them on the hierarchy, but then they want the people below them to kick ass. They let themselves be objectified by this guy, but then they objectify the people below them. It used to be called authoritarian personality disorder.
Huh.
That is an entirely narcissistic structure. That's fascism.
Yes.
And so such a paradoxic thing that the communism was meant that everybody was going to be cared at, and it produced fascist states where basically turned everybody into an egocentric, grandiose narcissist who was going to kiss that ass and then want these asses kicked, or they pretend to do that because if I don't pretend to do it, somebody's going to fuck me over.
You mean
Okay.
my plan for utopia turned into a dystopia? Imagine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and most recently we see that with the whole Trump phenomena. Okay.
Yeah,
And
go
and
there.
so this is why those of us that can see fascism, you can't see it from the inside, if you have a culture that has created that cultural blind spot, are
Yep.
more scared by the last 5 years than we've ever been before. Okay, because
Yeah.
fascism is pretty scary, and I know that if a fascist structure took over my environment, I'd be one of the first people they go after, because fascism has antibodies to people that are aware of what's happening and really want everybody to be treated with respect.
Yeah, if you have autonomy and you're able to transcend the cultural blind spots, then you're going to be able to make choices and to influence others outside of that groupthink.
Yeah, so that's where you got the Cultural Revolution in China, and you got Stalin killing 20 million of his own people in Russia.
Right.
It's like, okay, you had the killing fields in Cambodia. You just see it again and again. Okay. And so you see fascism growing. Those of us that see it are pretty scared. That's probably the most dangerous thing that human beings create in social systems. And it's a natural stage the human social systems go through. And it's a natural form that will arise out of social systems. And if it's not regulated by the collective, it takes over.
Yeah.
Um,
And certainly if, like there's research that shows that you will contradict your own like cognitive rational understanding of how things work based on social standing,
that's
right?
right.
That if you're in the Republican camp and like Trump dictates approval, you will convince yourself that you believe this, even if you actually know for a fact it's wrong.
Yeah, and the difference between the Trump republicanism and then the Bush republicanism,
Yep.
which was Bush republicanism was amber. It was fundamentalism.
Yeah.
That there actually was some set of principles that got lip service, and actual people actually believed in them. It was a form of fundamentalism that did objectify people on the outside. Amber needs an enemy, creates an enemy, and then objectifies and attacks that enemy for gratification. That's a narcissistic behavior that's normalized. That's
Yes.
unhealthy narcissism. It's normalized in that structure. Red narcissism doesn't have to have any internal consistency whatsoever.
Right.
And the whole capacity for cognitive dissonance is not just eliminated, it is punished.
Yes.
And so when what's his name said that we don't want to be the stupid party, the governor of I forget his name. It
Uh-huh.
was Eastern India. Anyway, he was ostracized and never come back. Okay, Bobby something. Okay, why? You're not supposed to say the emperor has no clothes. If you do, you get killed. Okay,
Jindal, Bobby Jindal.
Bobby Jindal. Okay, so that was it. You cannot say we don't want to be the stupid party.
Yep.
No, as a matter of fact, we're going to be the stupid now.
We're thriving on that.
We're thriving on the stupid party now. Unfortunately, then that the next logical step was Trump, where now it's red. Doesn't have to. It's just you kiss my ass and you're good, and you don't kiss my ass, you're not. And then if you're part of my group, you can do that with the other people, and we can objectify the others and do anything with it we want to them because they're the others. And not only can we do it, we can do it and get gratification from it.
I was going to ask so is this narcissistic traits or narcissistic personality disorder when we're talking about the Trump situation?
With the people in the Trump camp, those 72 million Americans, mostly traits.
Yep.
All the Nazis were not sadists, and we're
That's
not,
right.
they were being good Germans. Okay. Most of the Trump people, if you have a flat tire outside their house, they'll help you change it and be great about it. Okay. And they'll treat you with respect. But if you create a certain group where there's an outside, and then we can do symbolic damage to them, particularly if we don't have to see the babies suffering and the kids going crazy because they're separated from their mothers, or people dying of starvation because we're not helping them, or dying of disease because if we don't have to see that, we can just do it from an objectified. We will do violence to others and feel self-righteous about it.
Acceptable losses, easy rationalizations.
Yeah, as long as it's not me and mine. Okay, like it's not like there's Christians dying, or like my son my son or daughter. And so that's the unhealthy narcissism that is normalized in that culture. And basically in the first tier, there is unhealthy narcissism normalized in red. Hey, I'm in charge, do what I want. In amber, you're on the outside. Now I can exploit you, extract from you, or abuse you for gratification. Okay, that's unhealthy narcissism in conformist. Rational society, oh, you lost all your money, you lost, you're poor, that's your own responsibility. Fuck you. We're all responsible for ourselves. Winners get extra attention, losers don't. I remember my brother said that when I asked him about Trump. What do you like about Trump? My brother's a Trump guy. Carries a 45 everywhere he goes. But good guy, but
Yep.
Trump guy. He said, well, I like those, rich made a lot of money. They shouldn't have to pay as much. Okay, why? They earn it. It's funny thing about my brother. I love my brother. He was a Superior Court judge, totally fair with everybody.
Yeah.
Never discriminated. But his whole life, he was basically on a salary with the government. He was a district attorney, and then he was a federal judge. Total conservative, like every man for himself, your own recess. Meanwhile, Keith, the progressive one, I was literally introduced at his retirement party. I'm the liberal from Santa Barbara. Keith, basically in therapy, private practice, running his own business, his whole life, not relying on anybody, not getting one nickel from insurance companies because they're not going to pay for the kind of treatment that I want.
Right.
Okay. And I'm progressive. Okay. I want people to tax me and help poor people. Okay. It was weird psychological justification.
Family dynamics are the best.
Family dynamics are the best. And again, you don't get cognitive dissonance in your blind spots. Okay. So orange people, rational people will not get cognitive dissonance about I'm a caring person, but I will allow groups of people to be disadvantaged. I will let 50 people in the United States, 50% of the people in the United States suffer psychologically, physically, and financially with income in disparity. Why? Because it's not hurting me, and they're losers. Okay.
Yeah. Relative inequality is always there, right?
It's always there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't feel no responsibility for changing it. Okay, so that's unhealthy orange, okay, which runs an awful lot about haves and have-nots and success. Unhealthy green is different. Remember, green, pluralistic people, they don't care that much about money, at least consciously, but they do really have contempt for people that don't do it. So they establish, their narcissism through their contempt of people that aren't caring for other people.
Yeah, their violence comes out towards people who they think are violent.
Oh, you some capitalist wanting to make a lot of money. Yeah. You just want to be in charge of everything. Oh, you think the Bible has so you see their narcissism in this belief that, everybody has the right to have their opinion. But if you don't have my opinion, you're somewhat of a contemptible person. Ken Wilber hates that. It just drives him. For some reason, I don't know why, green pathology bothers him more than
well, I mean, in my experience in the integral community, it's like we all gathered around originally to be post-green. And
that's true.
You have to, in the dialectic, you have to make object of the thing that you're pushing off of. And so we got to create a we space, a community around teal being post-green. So, that's teal's shadow, right? It has allergies to green. And so we all love to pick on green, and it was good. It's really good to, have that mental models. And that's, turquoise, proper integral stages of development is when we can actually be integral green, that's the good stuff.
Which brings us to healthy narcissism in red. Healthy narcissism in red is the warrior that does not allow people to be abused in his presence. Period. Okay. Now that's pretty narcissistic if you think about it. It's like, oh, you got laws about, I don't care about your laws. I care about my own sense of protecting people from abuse. Okay. That's healthy narcissism in red. Healthy narcissism at conformist level. Jesus said to love everybody, everybody's a brother. You're not acting in a loving way to that person. That's not okay with me.
Yeah.
That's healthy conformist. And I'm right. And I'm going to go with that. I don't care what you say. Okay.
Yeah.
Capitalism. Healthy capitalism is Sean Esborn Hargens is really good with this. You look at different forms of capital. So there's environmental capital, and there's emotional capital, and there's developmental capital, and there's sexual capital, and there's spiritual capital. So uh, if you go, okay, I have all these forms of capital and I want to be successful doing all these things, and I want my company to create these kinds of values, and that's way superior to others. Well, that's kind of a healthy sense of grandiosity at Orange.
For
Okay.
sure. Yep.
Okay. And similarly agreeing, okay, I want everybody I want to treat everybody with respect and care, and I want everybody to be cared about. And I know it's an imperfect world, and I'm just going to do my best to be respectful and caring towards everybody. And I firmly believe that's a superior way of being. Feel a little sorry for people that don't do that, but I'm going to still love them. Okay.
That's right.
A little bit of grandiosity in that. Okay. But that's healthy narcissism. Okay.
Yeah.
That's one of the I think the awakenings for me in terms of my own narcissistic wounds. I'm like you. I started doing therapy when I was 23 years old, and I started studying it when I was 15. So
Yeah.
I've done at this time I've done over 65,000 therapy sessions. And and when I was in my 20s, I was always an integral thinker, and I would see the blind spots in people's systems, and I got arrogant. I
Sure.
thought,
Of
well, I
course.
know more than you guys do. You're full of, I caused me a lot of problems. Hubris leads to
Nemesis. Yeah.
nemesis. Okay, well, another way of saying that is humility comes from humiliating experiences. You take your humiliating experiences and you turn them in
Oh,
humility.
and the Dunning-Kruger effect is real, right? You know enough to be dangerous. You can hurt a lot of people.
Well, and that's how I learned about borderlines. I got burned with a borderline personality disorder, so I started studying it. I
Yeah.
got burned with a narcissistic personality disorder and started studying it, and went, God, Keith, you don't know everything. Why don't you start studying stuff? And for me, that all got jacked incredibly, an order of magnitude, when I discovered Integral, because
Yeah.
the meta system of Integral for someone who's a seeker and hungry to know as much as they can about their stuff, it organizes you in a way that you can grow strategically. And so for me as a psychotherapist and as a teacher, the integral epistemology was just priceless in terms of helping me understand my own personal cosmology, and then help other people develop their cosmologies.
Yeah, similar for me. I mean, getting that wide open field kind of blasted open of just like this huge structure for understanding things, and then been working the past 20 years to, try to fill that in and have it's infinitely humbling in many ways, even though people say how integralists, are so arrogant because we have our hierarchical vertical ways of looking at things. And I completely agree with that. And I'm feeling humbled by it every day.
Well, and when you're in service is really a good thing,
Sure.
because you're always going from one hypothesis to another. And if this one isn't working, you got to go, oh, that's not working, I'm trying another one. And it's especially good with executive coaching, because you're dealing with managers. The biggest blind spot in modern business is middle management.
That's right.
I don't know why, but people keep hiring these idiot middle managers who don't know how to manage, or they're a great engineer. They don't recognize middle management is an art form that is a learnable art form for most people, but you got
Yes.
to have object relations, you got to have empathy, you got to have self-awareness, and you got to know what you're doing. You're there to embody the core principles of your mission, and you're there to help people grow on the job, and that's your job as a middle manager, period. Okay.
That's why we have jobs as executive coaches, is because a founder who's been building their business and now needs to learn how to manage managers requires a lot of help to do that. But as you say, these are teachable, measurable behaviors.
That's right.
But if you're hiring middle managers and you're like, oh, this person's ready, they're an engineer, they're ready to step up, and you're not paying for a coach for them, or some serious scaffolding for them, you're setting yourself up for some costs.
Yeah, and what'll happen if you have a lousy middle manager is all the best employees will leave.
Yeah.
They'll just go, hey, I know my worth. I have healthy narcissism. I'll go someplace where they'll appreciate me. Okay. I've seen this happen in local organizations, and it drives me crazy.
Or they'll demand a flat governance structure, and then you really got problems on your hands.
Oh God. God, just shoot me. So another thing, though, talking about founders, you can develop narcissism if you're put in an entitled environment and you don't have the wherewithal to regulate yourself in that environment.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Uh-huh. Yes.
Okay. So think about 18-year-old rock star.
Yes,
Okay, up
exactly.
to that, I've just been, like making songs in my, in my bedroom or with my band, and now a year later, people are treating me like I'm a god.
The greatest thing since John Lennon. Yeah.
Okay, so that's why if you're a rock star, you're 5 times more likely to die than other people. Okay, because it's a tremendously self-destructive lifestyle. You feel entitled.
The child celebrity, the phenomena of the child celebrity. I mean, who has been a child celebrity that made it out okay,
Yeah, there's a few, but it's hard. If you get a lot of notoriety, what are you going to do with that? Now, some people use it as a boost. Monica Lewinsky is a good example. They use it as a boost to somehow transcend a form so that they can serve.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You create a new career for yourself based on a thing that's come up. That type of brand, marketing is hard to come by.
Or say you have a successful business and now all of a sudden I'm worth 10 million, 100 million, $1 billion.
Yep.
People, now remember, we all exist in social hierarchies. If you go into a hierarchy and you are high in that hierarchy, people will project onto you a luminance. And that projection of luminance feels really good. Okay, that's narcissistic supply. And we all like it. Okay, and we all need it. And so you can get addicted to that to the extent that if it's not happening, you feel like there's something wrong. And also you can get addicted to the sense if you make a mistake, can't be my mistake, it has to be somebody else. Now I'm beginning, if I indulge those impulses, I am now growing my narcissistic self. If I grow it enough, it starts, like I said, this is a human capacity. If it gets out of balance, that's when it starts causing problems.
Is this like type 1 versus type 2 diabetes, where like type 2 diabetes, adult onset narcissism?
Yeah, that's right. It's adult onset narcissism. And it's hard. It's if you've had that kind, I've talked to super wealthy people on occasion. I have a lot of successful people I've worked with over the years, as you might imagine. I mean, they say, I want feedback. I want you to tell me like it is. Okay. And I'll go, okay. So I try to be gentle.
Yeah.
But at a particular point, I'll tell them something that they just don't want to hear.
Yeah.
And then either they say, okay, that's it for you, Keith. And I go the way of lots of other people that have not told them. Or they go, okay, so I'm pissed about it. Let's work it out. Okay. Now, at that particular point, that's a milestone. Okay.
Yes. Now
there's another level of self-awareness of functioning that they're examining. And that gives them more capacities actually to lead. And this leadership is really about service.
Yes.
Okay. And so service is one of the main vehicles out of narcissism. Just like if you're in a relationship and you enter a defensive state, which by definition is a self-absorbed state, the way out of that is compassion for the other. Okay?
Yes.
If I develop compassion for the other, now I have regulated out of my defensive state, which is, I have distorted story about being abused or about being better. I have destructive impulses. I have amplified and numbed emotions. If I develop compassion for other, all of a sudden now I'm in a different level of attunement. If there's a narcissistic trait that was activated, as it often is because defenses are egocentric, that's been deactivated, and now I'm into healing.
Yeah, that's always been my understanding, is that it's basically how resourced are we as a human being. If I'm under-resourced, I haven't been eating or sleeping very well, I'm beating myself up, then my narcissistic and otherwise unhealthy traits for relationship are going to start coming online. And as a mature adult, as a self-aware human being, I can look for the canaries in the coal mines. That's what I try to work with people on. It's recognize, your addictions and allergies as you come on. So where the trim tabs are to get yourself back on shape, know how to regulate yourself, and you can come back to stasis. But what I'm starting to understand here is it's okay, we've got narcissistic personality disorder. It's rare. It's hard to work with. These people don't have empathy. It's tough to get them to learn how to regulate. But now we have this narcissistic traits, this adult onset narcissism, which if we don't know how to regulate ourselves, resource ourselves, take care of ourselves, deal with our addictions or allergies or whatever they are, then we really can have just as toxic of a relationship with ourselves, with others, than someone with NPD.
Yeah, sure. It's and and people could heal from personality disorders. You just got to acknowledge you got one. That's a big step. Very much like addiction. Addiction is an extreme example of this. Addiction by nature is narcissistic.
Yes.
It's egocentric. And as I was mentioning to you earlier when we were talking, you can almost tell when somebody developed their alcoholism or their coke addiction or whatever, because whatever their level of development was at that time, interpersonally, psychosexually, or sometimes even cognitively, it gets arrested once the
Yeah.
addiction is in place. Addiction creates an egocentric dynamic that creates arrested development. And one of the most beautiful things about recovery is that, remember, if you're an addict, there's still a self in there that's been desperate to grow, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
for decades.
Mm-hmm.
So you get into recovery and you get rid of that and you start working the steps on it. If you're doing a 12-step thing, sometimes people will make phenomenal progress on a lot of developmental lines in the first couple of years.
I think it's, hard for some people to understand because it's like an order of magnitude of behavioral development, and it's like a 4-quadrant affair. You
Oh,
can't
yeah.
just like a diet, just be like, oh, I've started a new program, my 20-year addiction is just going to go away. No, it's like you got to like change your job, make all new friends, move town. Like you basically have to kind of shed everything if you have a chance to transcend this.
And have a new sense of self. For
Yeah.
the narcissistic traits associated with addiction, one of the great things about the 12-step program is my life is unmanageable.
Yeah.
I'm fucked up. My life is unmanageable. I need help. Okay.
Step one.
Step one. Okay. So that when you're dealing with narcissism, that is the step that has been avoided for the entire life of a narcissistic personality person or someone with narcissistic traits. There's some part of me that I just refuse to face, and I will create these layers of entitlement and grandiosity. And sometimes it's not entitlement grandiosity, by the way. There's a form of narcissism, depressed narcissism, where if someone doesn't feel especially great, they just feel especially fucked up. I'm special because I'm wounded. I deserve special attention because I'm such a
Yeah.
messed up person.
Addicted to the self-image of like, I don't deserve better. I've never known better. But it's like motivational interviewing, which is like the technique they use for
Yeah.
like cult deprogramming. It's like the core technique there is it kind of boils down to like, how's that working out for you?
How's it working out for you? Yeah.
Just like pointing to the costs of these things. Like, are you getting what you wanted? Like when you first started doing this thing or whatever, and you can turn the person like, actually, no. What, you mean there's something else on the menu?
There's a guy in town that for about 20 years, his job was when someone had a DUI, not a DUI, when someone had an accident and they were drunk or loaded, any kind of physical disaster, they'd end up in the hospital. Okay, so the next day, they're in their hospital bed, all messed up from their car accident usually, but something else. He'd go in there and he'd say, so, it says here that your blood alcohol level was 0.35, it's huge. Or, you had cocaine in your blood. And he would just do a little motivational interview with the guy.
Hmm.
You go, hey, if you considered talking to somebody about this, and here's a number, give this number a call. Just one of those conversations.
Sure.
Recidivism for the people that got that went down. I forget what it was, something
Really?
ridiculous, 30-40%. Because you were hitting at a point when someone was going, God, I wish I hadn't gotten drunk and rolled my car and broke both my legs. There was a moment where they were a little bit more open. There are developmental places, the birth of your first child, where you're just opened up physiologically and psychologically. Sometimes it can happen with a marriage. Sometimes it can happen with a disaster. It happens frequently when there's a health crisis. People will feel psychologically transformed. I really discovered that I needed to become a better person.
It's interesting. I mean, yeah, you're really kind of getting into non-ordinary states of consciousness. From a spiritual perspective, you're closer to God, right? If it's childbirth or a near-death experience, it's a great opportunity to reauthor self because you're that close to the core of things. And I think, the big advent of psychedelic based therapy, which, has its own dignities and disasters, but people are so attracted to it because the results of people really getting that close, getting closer to the divine, getting closer to the core of who they are, and actually having behavioral flexibility there.
I love the psychedelic therapies that are coming out.
Mhm.
Just love them. I mean, it's still too soon
Too soon.
for me to be able to systematically include them, and I
Yep.
don't have the energy to. I mean, I guess I
Kicks up a
could go
lot of
be,
dust.
I could go out be a guide, I guess, but I don't. Maybe I'm too lazy to do it. But I love it when my clients. There's a couple of people I know in California, and I'll refer my clients to it. And also, I'm very curious about microdosing psychedelics instead of taking antidepressants.
Sure. Yeah,
Modern antidepressant
between
drugs are horrible.
between that and Adderall, I think the problem there is, people think they're microdosing when they're actually taking dosages and
They're
then
dosing.
going to work and driving home and things like that. We're still very early on in the cultural integration of this, and I hope too many eggs don't get cracked in the process. But I think it does have a lot of. I'm optimistic as well.
Yeah, me too. I'm stoked about it. I like and my clients. I love it when my clients do it. I'll spend a weekend like doing a journey with somebody, and then I get to process it with them in our next session. And boy, it's like coming in with a plate full of great stuff to work on. I mean, oh boy, I don't have to dig for this.
Yeah.
It's right here.
Well, so this is really great. We've geeked out in the developmental terrain, and then all over the place. And so I hope this is really useful for those listening. But in relationship to narcissism, I think we've unpacked a lot here. What do you think about like these new nuances coming out, like covert narcissism, like the distinctions where like I need to be close to the leader, and like it's not me being grandiose, but I need to make sure I defend Trump or whoever it is. Is that closer to the personality disorder or the traits, or how does that figure in?
Well, again, we're looking at now the social structure that supports it.
Yeah.
And it, again, it's a fascist support structure, it's authoritarian support structure. We're so social that if we decide to go into a culture, we're going to start evidencing the characteristics of that culture. And so that's for better or for worse. What are the good rules of thumb around narcissism? Rule of thumb number one: if someone is evidencing, pathological narcissism, well, that actually has a technical term, unhealthy narcissism, and they get challenged, they'll tend to demean the other person and withdraw from them. They'll have difficulty receiving negative feedback and acting on it. And they have difficulty maintaining intimate relationships. They'll find some way of ending it. Okay. So
Yeah.
it's just a good rule of thumb.
Good.
There are lots of different variations, but the variations will have the same quality. There's a sense of entitlement and a sense of suspending a sense of moral responsibility to other people. I'm objectifying other people in service of whatever I'm doing with this person.
Yep.
And when that happens, that's when bad things happen.
Yes.
One thing you got to have if you have integral understanding is a sense of humor. Because if you don't, you just want to go shoot yourself because you see a lot of unnecessary suffering. And maybe it's not unnecessary, but it looks unnecessary because you go, hey.
Hurts more, bothers you less, right?
Yeah. How often do we find ourselves quoting Ken to each other? That guy has
Well,
woken me up more than anybody else.
I think did you like the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country about Rajneesh Osho, and a lot of it was interviewing his assistant, kind of his right hand woman, and so that's where this talk about covert narcissism kind of fits in. I mean, she might qualify for both, but definitely it's like there's a lot of things you could say great about the work that they were doing in that community, but of when they really started just bypassing some moral things to protect him, to protect the community and all of that.
Anytime someone comes up with a spiritual rationalization for entitlement or exploitation, okay, we got spiritual bypassing happening, and then now you're put in crisis if you're part of that community.
Yep.
If you go along with it, now you're drinking the Kool-Aid, and literally, and you're poisoning yourself and your spirit. It gets more obscured by those narcissistic layers. If you take a stand against it, you're often excluded from the community. And we all know that, the Andrew Cohen movies with Conscious 2, the Rajneesh experience, the Maharishi experience. we can go on and on. So we all know that, and I've talked to Rajneeshpuram people that remember it fondly. There's an awful lot of good stuff that happens, but remember, when you get that glow is an addictive thing. Okay,
Yes.
it's pleasurable, and if you're aware, when I'm channeling the spirit, it feels great, and I like the glow I get back. Okay, but it's important to know when that's happening and when it's not happening. Okay, and so if I have to pretend that I'm always doing that, then I am creating narcissism in myself. It's fun to be the expert. I like being an expert. I like people asking me questions. I like when I'm in a workshop, people project a lot of luminance onto me.
Totally. Yeah.
Well, that's great because I can use that luminance to
That's
help
right.
them grow.
Serve them. Yeah.
Okay, if I've got that, man, I can put my hand on their head and say, okay, look, I want you to remember this moment. That this is a moment where you decided to love yourself. Okay. And, and they've given me the power to do that because they've projected it onto me. Of course, when you do that, there's a certain kind of spiritual electricity that goes through you that's just totally intoxicating. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, that's Keith in that environment. And then there's Keith looking at the toilet going, I have no idea how to fix this thing. And I'm going to have to get some expert. And I feel like an utter idiot trying to fix there's never mind, get my computer out of whatever the hell it got into. So
That's right.
The modern age kind of puts us in the situation of having a certain, looking in the mirror like that exercise you do. These are your strengths. These are your weaknesses. And these are the things that you need to work on to be a better person.
Yeah, I think this is a really important distinction that you just teased out here. Living in the modern age that we are and the complexities of this, that we can have enough maturity to say, well, when I sit in this seat, in leading in this way, I'm embodying this vehicle and it channels with it. And then when I'm fixing the toilet or when I'm doing another thing that's a different line of development, just because I lost at tennis this morning doesn't make me less useful here or something like that. But nevertheless, still be aware that we can always fall into that pitfall and
That's right.
think that I am great at these other things or that I'm infinitely luminous when these things are intoxicating in the same way that as a man, if I get, close to a woman and those chemicals start going in me, I'm going to start deprogramming my rationality about my commitments, right?
Oh, yeah.
And we have to be mature about these things. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have powerful vehicles. And I think that's where the postmodern, the green mindset often comes. It's in the same way that they're saying like all the language is all oppression, the phallo-logocentric patriarchal oppression of language, as if we shouldn't have language, where it's important to say, it's like, no, these good, true, beautiful assets that our ancestors have inherited to us are worth protecting, and we have to be mature people to be in relationship with them. And we have to really be watching ourselves when we come into these places of this intoxication and have the cultural safeguards. All four quadrants, the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha have to evolve together. As we're wrapping this all together, it's like, well, what are the core practices for how we as maturing, evolving adults protect ourselves or like grow with these things? How do we work with this?
Well, first of all, that was very well said. That was great.
Thanks.
And that's what Sangha's for.
Yes.
Okay. And that's what Dharma's for. The Dharma is the truth that has been beautiful, good, and true to us through all four quadrants that we reference our behavior to. The Eightfold Path, the eight, right this, right that. Those are all referring to processes. Right mindfulness, right samadhi, right livelihood, right thought, right action. These are all processes. They're how we navigate. And right has a particular meaning at least in Buddhism, which is you're in harmony with the infinite. Okay. And that means all consciousness is important to you. So one thing is you have a group around you that isn't afraid to tell you when they think that you're being irritating, frankly, or they think you're bullshit. I have a lot of hostility towards pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies, but if I get one sentence out around my wife, daughter, or son about it, I'm lucky because they say, we don't want to hear about it. Stop it. And justifiably, they regulate me and I receive that regulation. So one thing, have people that give you feedback about what's great and what's not great, and pay attention to it and use it to grow, which
Yeah.
is one of the most beautiful aspects of Integral. Integral says you never arrive.
I think
You're
this is,
just always navigating yourself forward optimally, and there's
yes.
always farther to go.
Yeah. The Tao is always a process, not a destination. Right.
Exactly.
And, yeah, I think this is exactly right. There needs to be a community of the adequate, which
Mhm.
can appropriate, with our conditions, be a mirror, be a reflection. And also it's like coming from someone who built a community training on feedback, I learned that you can also screw that up because then everybody wants to kick you all at the same time. And there's also something to be said for like, yeah, we don't give feedback in an immature way too, right? That there's maturity in all things.
Well, in the Cultural Revolution, they used to do criticism sessions, right? Put somebody in the center and they all just attack them. Why? Well, their dharma was suspect dharma. Okay. And in
Sure.
retrospect, everybody, so, it's complicated, so there's always that inner voice. There's a wise self in all of us.
Yeah.
And so our contemplative work, particularly working on the witness, helps us identify that wise self. That wise self, if we listen to that wise self's palate gets more and more sensitive to what's beautiful, good, and true, and what's not.
Yeah.
And then we find other people that resonate with that, okay? And that's
Yeah.
our sangha. Okay?
So
And then we discover where we've made a mistake, or where we've done something particularly great, or we have trouble acknowledging our greatness, which is the wonderfulness about that exercise you described. About you can't just look at your weaknesses. You need to look at your strengths. You can't just look at the parts of you that are unattractive. You need to acknowledge and celebrate the parts that
yeah,
are.
when I'm working with my clients on giving feedback, whether managing down to their direct reports or managing up, I teach a plus delta practice, which is
Yeah, good.
just like the most basic form. What's working? What could improve? It's okay if you can't get the courage up to do the really hard differentiating feedback. To tell them what's working well so they know where to double down, and you're still giving feedback, and don't ever skip over that because we need to know.
Yeah, that's super important.
Yeah.
And so just again, we could go on forever and ever about it. So let's use that as kind of our capstone of our
Good.
conversation about
Perfect.
narcissism.
Well, this is really great. Yeah. So, in our capstone, it's like, as we as evolutionary humans dealing with our own narcissistic traits, because our 2-year-old lives with us forever, right? And
That's
if
right.
we're going to stave off and not let that, adult onset diabetes, that adult onset narcissism creep in, then we need to know how to regulate ourselves. We need to have that awareness and, how to investigate our shadows. And then, as you said, the contemplative practices of like nurturing our causal witness, so that
Exactly.
we have access to that wisdom to inform us, and have that in those that are around us, have our sangha, have our community that could hold that all together. And if we have those components, just that, then we have a chance not to let our Instagram identity eat us in our sleep.
Yeah, we'll do fine. And we'll contribute, which is quite beautiful.
I hope so. Well, this is great. Thanks for those that have stuck with us in the recording and through all the places that we navigated. If there's some place that was, over your head, follow up on it, research, this is great terrain. Definitely don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. Be happy to continue talking about this more. And enough about me. What do you think about me? And but I want to take a moment, just, Dr. Keith, just of all the things that you shared, I know there's people that are going to want to follow up with you. So once again, you can find all the information you need about Dr. Keith Witt on his website, drkeithwitt.com, one word. And, definitely be sure to check out the books that Keith has written. Particularly, I've enjoyed, Shadow Light, which came out 3 or 4 years ago. That's all about the terrain of what we were talking about earlier on the call of persona work and the shadow and what we can't see. And what do we know about what works to work with that? And then Loving Completely was more recent, just on relationships, and all the work that you have done with couples and on relationships in general is a deep dive into that territory. You mentioned several of your other books, A Gift of Shame, and I loved Integral Mindfulness. And then you have online courses for several of these and on different topics that either through integrallife.com or through the website, you can track down of where you can engage Keith's work in a more engaged way, in a more direct way. And
Yeah, and sign up for my website. If you sign up for my website, you get a video plus some resources every week for the next 14 weeks. It's just
really,
of things that I found particularly useful and I wanted to share. So,
yeah,
and it doesn't cost anything. So get
yeah.
on board, sign up for my website.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Keith. Thanks all of y'all who are listening. I want to hear your comments. You can email me or however you're listening to this. Hopefully, there's a comment field. I think there's probably plenty more for us to talk about. So, whether it's the psychology domains, the spiritual domains, the integral domains, I'm sure we'll find another topic that people need to hear the dignities and disasters about. So, thanks for taking your afternoon here to talk with us today, Keith.
And thanks for having me on the show. It was a lot of fun. Good seeing you, Robert.
Likewise, let's do more soon.